Welcome to the Gateway Spotlight, everyone. My name is Brooke Roberts, your host, and I'm very excited to be interviewing and spotlighting the founder of the Gateway International Group, Dr. Anthony Ogden. Welcome to the show, Tony.
Thank you so much for having me, Brooke. I have to say at the outset of this conversation, I'm under Brooke says, Tony, we have to do this show. People are wondering what Gateway is all about. You have to be part of the show. And I said, nobody wants to listen to me. But nonetheless, she's twisted my arm and here I am. And thanks everybody for being here. It's great. I look forward to the conversation, Brooke.
I think this is going to be the most popular episode of the season. I predict it now. So y'all let us know afterwards, share it, watch it, give us some good stats so I can be proven. So Mike Wolf is here. Hello, Mike. He's in freezing London. Everyone, Caleb McGill is here from Clemson, South Carolina. So yeah, as you guys are coming in, please introduce yourselves. And of course, drop any questions or comments that you have throughout the interview in the chat. And we'll try to address some of those as we go through the conversation. Hello, Kathy from Dallas, Texas. And I'm guessing, Tony, you probably know all these names as they're coming in. All right, let's dive into this. Let's start with my favorite question to ask people in international education is, how did you launch into the international education as a career? How did you find yourself in this funny little world of ours?
I've always let people come into international higher education in two ways, really. Those who set out and they say, this is what I'm going to do, and they make their what I call vertical movers. And then there are those that are coming in horizontally, mean they found their way into international education from some other path, maybe as a faculty member or whatever. I am definitely, without a doubt, the vertical person. I was over in Japan earlier in my career. My first job, in fact, was in Japan. And I thought, where I was living in Western Japan in this tiny village where I didn't speak a word of Japanese and very few folks spoke English. And I was just learning my way and having a ball. And they had me taking students to various places around the world, student groups. And I thought, this really has to be a career in this because I was really loving it. And I learned about SIT up in Vermont. And I thought, you know what, this is going to be my career. And fast forward to today, at 30 years later, it has really been my career and it's one that I've really enjoyed.
I love hearing that because I feel like oftentimes we hear more about that horizontal lift, depending on people's generation and how old they are and how long they've been in the field. But I think a lot of times the stories of people who've been around for a long time, it was that accidental, you've been abroad, so here's a job doing things international at a campus. So let's rewind a little bit. How does one end up in Japan?
We now have, many people have heard of the program called the JET program, where you were going out and working and teaching English and so forth. I was in the early stages, or the first year of the JET program, really. This is back in the late 80s. And it wasn't really called so much the JET program until a little bit after I was into it. But nonetheless, it was amazing. I'm this little boy from Kentucky. I had my first international trip and my only international trip at that point was to Indiana. And then so here I am. I didn't know anything about Japan whatsoever. And off I go to this tiny village called Uemura, as I said. And in a way, it felt a little bit like home because I was used to small town rural. Now, of course, Japan is culturally and linguistically so very different from anything I ever understood. And it really rocked my world. Now, I stayed on in that job. Of course, there was a maximum time for 3 years. And then I later on moved back to Japan and continued to live in Japan. And I married a Japanese person and so on. And so I tell you, Japan's really been part of my career and it's really informed how I see the world and certainly how I see our profession. I'll tell you something, Brooke, that most people don't know. I invested a lot of my career in education abroad, having worked at various universities and so forth. But I actually never studied abroad. And so here I am, writing and speaking and arguing with people about education abroad. But I felt a little bit like the opposite, right? A lot of people, as you said a moment ago, enter this profession because they had some experience. I didn't really have an education abroad experience. And so I was later in my 40s when I thought, I've got to do something here. And so I applied for an education abroad program in Argentina. I was probably almost 50, I guess, at that point. And I was in a classroom studying Spanish alongside 18-year-olds. And it was really odd and strange to be asked if I want to go to the disco on Friday night and so forth. But I had a great time. And so I eventually did ultimately study abroad.
I love that. So that we're going to go on a tangent here, but I love that you did that. I have a theory that I think that all international education professionals, every 10 years, we have to top up our study abroad experience or our international learning experience, because the world changes so much, the experience changes so much, and the way students, the way they show up in a new country, the way they apply to programs or research programs, all that stuff evolves very quickly. And I think for those of us who applied by paper, for instance, back in the day, or had to use phone cards to call home, or had to go to internet cafes to access the internet, like that is not the way the game is played nowadays. And I think for those of us in the field to really understand the student experience and to coach and advise and build programs for the modern student, we have to understand what is a realistic experience on the
I've
ground.
always thought what I did 5 years ago is different than what I do today and will be different yet again in 5 years hence. So I think, fortunately, our collective profession has changed so much. And I gotta tell you, I think it's wonderful. And I'm very optimistic about where we are today.
I love it. I love it. So I was going to ask you about, so how did you get interested in going to Japan? But what did you study in undergrad?
I went to a small school called Berea College. It's quite a special school in Kentucky. I was a first generation college student, and that was the only place I ever applied because college wasn't really a reality for me. And coming from a very large, very modest background, and so I applied to Berea College where they don't have tuition, and I worked my way. And incidentally, I worked in the international office in college, but I studied psychology and sociology then. I didn't know my left from my right, but Berea overall, however, was such a momentous opportunity for me. And in fact, it was the dean who said that I should go to this program in Japan. And I thought, what? I don't know anything about all that. But nonetheless, I did, and I followed his advice, and it was advice well taken.
Awesome. So let's fast forward. You obviously
Mhm.
launched yourself into international education as a career, and we don't necessarily need to go through play by play of what you did over these years. I know you worked at University of Kentucky, Michigan State, University of Wyoming, amongst many other stops along the journey. You guys can go creep him on LinkedIn if you want the play by play. But so now, you're the founder, executive director of the Gateway International Group, which is a business. And so I'm curious, what made you decide to go from working as a senior leader in international education on one university environments, already established yourself as a thought leader? You could have scooted on to retirement, respected, compensated. What made you decide to launch into entrepreneurship and launch Gateway International Group?
Thank you for that, Brooke. I don't know about thought leader, but I appreciate the comment. I had one of my very first real jobs in this profession with IES. I luckily and fortunately was hired on to be their director in Japan. And when I was in Japan for all those years and working for IES, I never worked so hard in my life. It was probably the hardest time of my career. But on the other hand, it was one of the best jobs I ever had. I loved working for IS, and it felt you'd almost have to visualize it. I felt like I could fly. Honestly, I felt every day my arms were outstretched and I was embracing new ideas, encouraged, in fact, to embrace new ideas and be innovative and support our students in real and meaningful ways. I learned so much at that time, and then I decided I wanted to get a doctorate degree. And so I came back to the United States. And so I was studying for my doctorate degree. And for the next 20 plus years, I was working at a university. Now, at a university, there's many benefits, of course, and we can talk about those all day. And I've loved most all of my jobs over my life. But when you work at a university, you have to deal with a whole different set of politics and structures and systems and protocols. And in a sense, I felt like I've been working a little bit like this. And so back I guess at the very early outset of the pandemic, I was by invitation in Thailand with a couple of others and also over in Malaysia. And at that time, it was very earlier on. And the folks over there were already using hand sanitizer, masking up, taking temperatures and all of that. And I came back and I thought, this is really going to be an influential juncture yet again in international education. And I was chatting with some colleagues. In fact, one colleague, I don't know if she's here now, Julie Pollard, and I were just chatting over the phone. And she says, we really need to be thinking about this as well. And so we had this great conversation. She says, it's as if the profession needs like a gateway to the next generation. And I thought, well, thank you very much, Julie. That might be exactly what we need to do. And I can tell you more about Gateway if you like, but here I feel like my arms are outstretched once again. Feel
Right.
like in a way I'm doing that work that makes me happy, makes me excited. I get to work with so many most wonderful people, some of whom are here in the room today, what we call Gateway affiliates. And I tell you, I'm so very fortunate.
That's great. Hat tip to Julie Pollard, you said? Julie Pollard?
Yeah,
A
from
little
UCU.
name inspiration. There you go, Julie. And those of you who joined a little late, welcome to the conversation. As I'm talking to the founder of the Gateway International Group, Dr. Anthony Ogden. We like to call him Tony. And so let us know in the chat where you're tuning in from around the world and say hello, because we do want this to be a conversation. We want your questions, your comments. So please ask a question as well. We're happy to jump into those later in the conversation. So let's dive into a little bit more. So you decided, okay, I want to do something that gives me a little more freedom that's still engaging with international education. What was the original sort of MO of the Gateway International Group? Like, what did you want it to achieve, especially in those early days when you launched it?
Well, I knew I had wanted to do something like this for a long time, but I didn't know exactly what. But with the pandemic, as it did for so many of us, it made us really question our existing strategies. It really made us question what we were doing and where we were going. And for some folks, that meant they were hiding under their desk, waiting this out. Others, they were looking around and seizing new opportunity. And I think I remember perhaps one of the best compliments that someone ever gave me. It was my dear friend and colleague, Nico McFarland at the University of Kentucky. She said, Tony, you have this unique ability of seeing around the corner. Now, I don't think she meant it necessarily as a compliment, because I think with sometimes if you do have that ability to see around the corner, you give everybody else stress. But on the other hand, it was a comment that really stayed with me, and I'm so very grateful for her. And I feel like that in a way, Gateway, that is the Gateway's role. That is what I think I can bring to Gateway. And that was really the impetus. And so you can see here on the little logo behind me there are three colors. And I knew I wanted to have this consulting section of Gateway. I knew I wanted to have a programming and operations division. But most importantly, perhaps the key for me was to have Gateway Resources, which is sort of a portal, if you will, of free information for international educators. I've always felt, and I've always said to my colleagues, that if you've been in this profession for a while and if you've made this your career, you have an obligation to support your colleagues. You have an obligation to support next generation professionals. You really need to contribute to the advancement of research and scholarship that informs our practice. And that's been a sort of a goal of mine, really. And so I thought we got to, no matter what we do with Gateway, we've got to have that section that provides resources and information to folks that are at various stages of their career who may or may not be members of some of our associations and so forth. And frankly, it's been really wonderful. Thousands of people each month go onto that page, and hopefully they're finding information that's useful to them. That makes me really happy. And it feels, and it makes me, it seems self-congratulatory, but truthfully, it makes me feel like I'm doing good work.
Yeah, no, I love that mission of the resources of Gateway. I know in my career, there's been various times where I had a lot of responsibility, but I was launching international education at an institution. And so I didn't have a budget or resources to join all those national organizations to get access to any of those resources. And so it was relying basically on Sakusal to email all of our colleagues saying, please help someone, so I don't have to recreate the wheel every time I wanted to get something done that I'm hundreds of universities that had already established and already achieved some momentum on. So I think that is an incredibly valuable piece of the field for sure. So one of the things that I know as a part, and I have an insider understanding of Gateway as being part of the team, but talk a little bit about the Gateway Pledge as a for-profit organization. This is not something you have to really think about or commit to. Can you explain a little bit about what it is and why you thought this was such an important part? Because also thinking about too, and I'd have to put this into context for people, I'm also an entrepreneur. And so I understand too, those early days of starting a business, you're not Scrooge McDuck swimming in cash. And putting out a pledge like you did takes a lot of, it shows your values, but it also takes a lot of courage, and especially in the early days of launching any kind of business. So tell us what it is and why you decided to do it.
I appreciate the question, and maybe others here in the room today will do the same, I hope, because I think it's so very important. I've long believed in international education. I believe that when our students are able to study abroad or international, some of the best and brightest people from around the world are able to come here, and or others engaging in some form of international learning, it really impacts that person and that person's family and that person's community. And in a sense, I've always looked at international education as social mobility. So to me, for example, if we're talking about education abroad, the goal is not to increase the number of students studying abroad. The goal is to be able to enhance our students' education about the world and their place in it. And by doing so, we invest in that student's social mobility. So if you believe in that, as I do, I said, well, then if it's truly going to be a value of mine, then I need to commit to it. And I don't have a lot of money. And so what I thought I would do, and my colleague who in the early days of Gateway is so very influential, May Arthur with MSM, she and I said, look, let's make a commitment. And we did. So essentially 5% of every dollar that comes to Gateway in any form, every dollar that comes to Gateway, we set it aside to support international learning and engagement. And I'm very proud of that. And currently, that money is primarily going over to the Fund for Education Abroad. And I'm so pleased. Just a couple of weeks ago, I was in DC, Washington, DC, for the FEA Gala. And this year, Gateway, thanks to everybody in the room here today, we were able to fund 2 scholarships. Both recipients are first-generation college students, people of color, but most importantly, they're from Kentucky, where I'm from. And so I'm very proud of
That's great. That's exciting. And I have to shameless plug here. I did interview Angela Schaefer, who's the executive director of FE a few weeks ago. So you can go back in our archives and listen to my conversation with her about the state of sort of scholarships and their role in advancing international education. So I'd highly encourage you to check out that conversation. So let's talk about the group part, because this is something that you and I have talked about privately. You're very passionate about it. So I want to give you an opportunity to talk about why you decided to start this as basically almost like a consortium of professionals in a way. But why the group? Why did you want to bring in all these other players to the Gateway International Group?
As you started earlier today in our conversation, our profession is constantly changing, and it's constant and it's growing. It's moving from generalist to specialist, right? So now we see specialists in so many different areas, not just those big knowledge groups like Education Abroad or IS or recruitment, but now we're seeing people who are focusing on marketing communications or international health, safety, security, or finance and so on. And there's so much more of a move for specialists. So if Gateway is going to be successful, we need to bring the best thinkers, the best practitioners who are real experts in one or more of those areas. And by golly, we've done that too. Every time we have a meeting, and you come to these meetings, Brooke, and I'm so grateful that you're there. When I see some of these people who I'm working with every day, I'm just so very intimidated. I see, for example, we have Dr. Kathy Winnie here with us today, and Kathy helps us with our Gateway executive search, and which I must say, thanks to Kathy and others of that team, is really doing well. And I feel like I'm really blessed. But more humbly, I feel like I've been around a while. I feel like I know a lot, but I don't know everything. I often know what questions to ask. And if we really want to be truly next generation focused, then we need to have the best and brightest thinkers amongst us. And so I feel like we're achieving that and getting better every day. And you're a part of that mix, Brooke, so thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. Yes, I'm very proud to be. So I wanted to switch things up. You guys are getting a little teaser to some sort of production changes we're going to be doing in 2023. And we will talk about the future, not just the past, for the Gateway International Group in just a minute. But I want to start a new segment called This or That. It's a lightning round. So I'm going to give Tony a few options. You just have to pick one or the other. No explanation needed, no context needed. Just go for it. You ready? The first one's pretty easy. The first one's pretty easy. All right. Coffee or tea?
Tea.
Okay. NAFSA or AIE?
AIA.
Physical books or Kindle?
Physical.
I knew that. I know the
I
answer.
I see Michael Wolf is here today, and I would love to have him answer that question.
Yeah.
Michael, put that in the chat. Physical or Kindle?
Well, and I know the next answer. I know the next answer to this one too. Podcasts or articles?
Articles for sure.
Wyoming or Kentucky?
Kentucky.
Yeah.
I believe
Early bird or night owl?
early bird.
Japan or Australia?
Japan.
Entrepreneur or employee?
Ooh, that's a tough one. I've never considered myself an entrepreneur, but I guess for today, I'm learning how to be one.
So you choose entrepreneur?
Yes,
Yeah. I was telling our producers about those questions and I said, entrepreneur or employee, it's a hard one. I've been both. They have their own challenges, their own stressors, their own frustrations. It's not always an easy decision. Thank you for playing our game. Thank you for that. So let's move on to some more meaty questions. And we have a few questions from the audience as well. So I want to make sure we leave plenty of time for that. But you have been very vocal and participating in the conversation and the research around this idea of scholar practitioner, where we bridge research and practice to change the field. Tell us a little bit about your sort of ideology and point of view on this idea and what's the role that the scholar practitioner is going to play in the future of international ed?
I think it's a very clear role. If we are going to call ourselves a profession, we have to have the credentials and the training and the knowledge to be a professional. And that means we need to study the literature. We need to be informed by the literature. We need to contribute to the scope and the direction of future research. In a way, I think of the scholar practitioner as a secular process, if you think, meaning you have researchers who are doing research that inform practice, but as we as practitioners have to shape and direct the scope of the research so that one informs and guides and the other. I think honestly, we don't have the luxury to be pure practitioners. We need to understand what the research and the scholarship has to say, and then make informed decisions. Especially if we're working at universities, faculty members, I'll just tell you a quick thing. A lot of folks ask me, should I get a PhD or not? And that's a big question, but most certainly one should be informed about their profession, because that is how faculty members and others will respect you. You need to know what you're talking about. And so for me, I've never considered myself a scholar, but I feel like I have an obligation to try to advance research and scholarship so it supports my work and therefore others.
That's interesting. So I'm curious what your thoughts would be. I believe in the scholar practitioner. I always tell people who want to launch their career in international ed, you have to geek out on international ed. You have to read some journal articles. And if that sounds like a non-starter for you, this probably isn't the field or career path you should choose. But I also think too that especially since the pandemic, I feel like this is a feeling. I have no research to back this up, but it feels like independent companies are taking and bearing more of the responsibility, more of the heavy lift to support the demand for mobility-based study abroad. And I think university offices are really struggling to staff up. I think everyone's really struggling to staff up, but I just think that the lean on independent provider companies was increasing before the pandemic, but I think is now. Do you feel that that is true? I guess for one, do you agree? And then two, do you think that plays a role in this sort of academic perspective of the scholar practitioner moving forward?
I don't know that I would fully agree that independent organizations are taking on the bigger work, but I think the changing dynamics of an international office are certainly at play. There's just no doubt about it. And that's always been the case. We're constantly shifting back and forth. And so when we think of the business of international education, it is certainly integrated all the way through and through international education broadly defined. There's just no way around it. And it goes back to the 1920s, truly. Our earliest education abroad providers were universities. And so I think it's really very important to really understand how to have that synergy across all sectors so we can support each other. One thing I want to also just mention before I forget it, and that is on Gateway Resources, we have a series of what we call foundational reading. A lot of folks say, yeah, Tony, I agree with you about that scholar practitioner thing, but where do I start? What do I read? If that is you, then go and pull down one of the, it's free. You can just download it and print it if you want, but it's a foundational reading and it just tells you what by category, what some of the key articles or the seminal reading is in those areas. And we try to keep those updated and we're looking to expand the foundational readings that are there. So if you're here and you want to contribute to one of those, please do. We would welcome that. I think they're quite helpful, especially the one I wrote.
Okay. Well, definitely. And if one of our producers could drop the link to that in the chat for those of you who are here live, would like to take a look, please do that. And I want to jump into a few questions from the audience. And again, if you do have a question, drop them in the chat, drop it in the Q&A area, and we'll launch into those as long as you guys are willing to stick around. So the first question that was submitted is, this person says, I'd be curious to hear how Anthony's curiosities arced towards decolonization within global education. Excuse me. Where does that stem from? What have you learned?
Thanks for that question. There are many folks that often associate me with that article I wrote quite a long time ago called The View from the Veranda. And in that article, I referenced education abroad students as colonial students. And I described the infrastructure around education abroad as potentially or arguably could be a colonial system. And the way where that came from was actually, it wasn't my idea necessarily. I was visiting Barcelona. I was at Penn State University at the time, and I was visiting there and I was chatting with a bunch of folks and students throughout the days and that I was there. And students were coming to me complaining about things like, oh, I heard this was a bilingual city, but very few people speak English. The Mexican food wasn't very good. They didn't really want to live with these these Spanish students because it just crimped their style. And I was like shocked. Of course, this was quite a long time ago. And I was just surprised by it all. And I was asking some of the local there of the programs, and they said, yeah, we call those folks colonial students. And so I got to thinking and I started doing some informational interviews and doing some reading and so forth. And it led to that paper. And I don't know if that paper was overly special or anything, because there have been so many better publications that have come out here even more recently in this area about decolonization. What I hope, however, won't happen, and that is I see an increasing debate almost a tug of war between folks that are prioritizing, for good reason, DEI initiatives, but at the expense of international initiatives. Somehow international is now seen as a problem, as it's colonial, as it's minimizing difference, or as it minimizes certain things, and that somehow there's this now tension. And I was chatting with a couple of universities not so long ago who their SIOs were telling me that their budgets are being displaced over to the DEI folks. And I think if that's any truth to that discussion, we're really going to have to sort that out, because to me, it's very important that we have a deep understanding of how all of our students approach culture, different cultures and their place among that. And so it's going to be important to me. I wouldn't say I'm necessarily an expert on decolonization. There are certainly people here in the room today that are.
I think that's really interesting because I think something I've been saying for a while since the pandemic was just how I feel like as international educators, we kind of got to rest on our laurels of mobility, like that being the largest tool in our tool chest to deliver that learning outcomes we were hoping students would achieve through those mobility-based programs. But I think we all know that like just dropping students in Barcelona or dropping a student in Shanghai does not an intercultural master make. And it does require some coaching and guidance and thoughtful program design to help that learning take place over a period of time. And that sometimes that learning doesn't have to involve moving around the globe or moving around the country, let alone, and that maybe we can achieve those same learning outcomes without the mobility piece. But I think you're right that I don't think they have to be at odds with each other. The idea of DEI and international, I think I'm really like loving the bringing in the phrase intercultural. I know this has been a field of study for a very long time. I know I'm not discovering this, but I think bringing that into our vernacular as professionals in this space, because I think it does then start to appreciate that domestic, maybe focused intercultural learning that we want to take place, but also the broader global perspective of that as well. And I think that when you were telling your stories about those interactions with students, I just remember a student coming home from a semester abroad in Italy, and you just think, wow, she's going to come back and have all these insights. And she just told me how much she loved Italy, but she didn't like Italians. And I just thought, I was just, wow. Yeah. So these are, she's definitely one of the, and not all students are like that, just a little, clarification there. But I think that it is an interesting thing that we need to go forward, realizing that mobility isn't our only tool to help teach these skills.
No, one of the things that hasn't changed out of the pandemic, a lot has changed. We're now exploring lots of different modalities, but one thing that hasn't changed and hasn't changed in decades is we still have a responsibility to graduate all students, every single one that truly, in my understanding, should understand the international nuances of their chosen disciplines and have some level of knowledge and experience and skills to be able to engage as a citizen, a contributing member of the community throughout their life as perhaps lifelong learners. I think that is our goal. That hasn't changed. How we get there may not be changing as much as it is expanding. How we design programs, how we deliver, how we assess our programs for all of our mobility-based programs or non-mobility-based programs is in discussion. That's why I think it's an exciting time.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
Okay, going back to the questions here. So we have another question. What do you want to I have this question too. So we're going to table this one for now and save it for the end. So this person asked, do you see global education as a tool for social justice? If so, how? If not, why?
Oh, there are a lot of folks here in the room that could probably answer that question better for me. I don't know enough, but I know that when we look at types of programs that we have to be very mindful. Going back to 1968 with Ivan Illich, To Hell with Good Intentions, I actually wrote a paper with Dr. Eric Hartman 50 years later after he gave that speech, To Hell with Good Intentions, and we titled that, it was actually a book chapter called To Hell and Back with Good Intentions, about what has changed and what hasn't. But I do think that international education broadly defined can raise students' awareness about the impact of their decisions can have. And so I do think that when you design for social justice, you can certainly use international education as a methodology to support that. I'm sorry that I can't better answer that question, but I do think it is important that we raise to students' awareness the impact that they have on the communities that host them, both here and abroad.
I think it's just really challenging about our work. And I know some organizations are starting to do this. Some universities do this really well. When we think about a mobility-based program where students are traveling abroad, it's really hinged on two kind of big themes. Like one is like getting there and the logistics of getting there and being there, from airfare, pre-departure, money, your housing, etc. There's a little bit of, hey, there's a different culture, beware, but there's not a lot of time for that deep dive preparation. And I think a lot of professionals would love to do more of that. And then the other component is their coursework, right? That may not have anything to do with this intercultural dynamic, the social justice dynamic that we're talking about. And it's just really interesting that we don't really have a core curriculum for international education that gets any kind of real fanfare, or there's not like a class that students have to go through. We hope you get a little bit in pre-departure. We hope there's a mention of it during the program, but really it's not embedded into the experience. Anecdotally, I studied abroad twice. I'm an undergrad from Northeastern University, and they have great programming now, and I'm sure they're doing much better things, but there was no mention of social justice or intercultural learning or any of these things in my preparation.
If you go, part of that is because our rationale is constantly shifting. Now, if you think about it, after World War II, when here in this country, in the United States, when we were talking about international education, especially education abroad, it was really about language and culture. Young girl going to France, she puts on a beret, she smokes a cigarette, she learns a few words of French. That was the goal, language and culture. And then over time, and I would arguably say it wasn't really until the late 80s, early 90s, started even talking about intercultural learning. And there were some real leaders in that mix that really pushed us along, from Milton Bennett, and many others really pushing us along at that point and talking and usually and basically saying the driving rationale for international education is intercultural learning. But now, if you fast forward to today, there are many other rationales. And so I'm about to be edgy. Some of those other rationales are really, some are driven by experiential learning. No, you really should go abroad to be able to do internships or service learning and things like that. And now, of course, we have so many folks saying, no, international education is about career preparation, career readiness. And maybe it always has. But what hasn't really shifted is that all of these rationales are still there. But people ascribe to different rationales. And I would argue, you're not going to like this, but I would argue that the intercultural rationale for international education is waning. I was at a very large university, and I was working with several hundred faculty directed programs. Not one single time did a faculty member come to me and say, I really want to enhance the intercultural competency of my students. Never once, nothing even remotely like that. Now, it doesn't mean that they didn't want that but oftentimes that wasn't a driving rationale. It was really their discipline or sometimes even just travel. The reality is intercultural. I fear that it really isn't becoming. And if you look at the type of programming that we've been doing prior to the pandemic, this might be a chance for some of us to have a point of reckoning where we say, what is our rationale? What are those outcomes that you spoke to earlier? What do we really want for our students and our institution and our communities? What do we really want? And then you say, okay, if these are our goals, then we're going to expand education abroad. We're going to recruit international students. We're going to engage our faculty in internationally oriented research and collaboration. We're going to do all these other things as methodologies to reach those goals. I often think that we let the methodology get in the way of the goal.
Yeah, I would agree. I think, what frustrates me, this was going to be my sort of juicy question for you. One of the things that frustrates me is that I'm standing in circles at cocktail hours at conferences, and you hear a lot of frustrations from practitioners and professionals who are just like, students, they're coming back and they're just colonizers or colonial minded. And all they can say is, it was awesome. And a very surface level sort of reflection and comprehension and I don't know, identity with their program. But I think the problem is then what are we doing about it? Why don't we reverse engineer our end game and say, okay, what are the paths we can take to get students to the outcomes that we want? So yeah, that's one of the frustrating things for me is I think study abroad can be very elitist. It's typically for the wealthy, the whites, the women. And I think you're lucky if you get to do it, if you're outside of that descriptor. But how are we going to be delivering these outcomes, whatever these outcomes supposedly we want, to every student, like you mentioned at the top? We do have more questions coming in that are deep and juicy. So I want to get to them, and we're happy to stay on, everybody. Do you have a meeting you got to get to, Tony?
I'm good.
Okay, good. We'll to some of these juicier questions. I know Mike asked one in the comments as well. But before we do that, and for those who kind of want to sign off and want to listen to the juicy stuff later, you can tune into our recording after this. But the last thing I wanted to talk about is back to Gateway specifically and talking about the future. We talked about why you started it and what you've been doing, but what can we see in the coming year? And then somebody also had the question, what's the goal in the next 10 years for Gateway?
I should have prepared. I should have known that you were going to ask this question. What is so interesting is Gateway is a new organization. I hope that we're around in 10 years, but so that is partially a goal to be around in 10 years. I hope I'm around in 10 years. But I would say one of the nice things about Gateway is because it's not driven by any personality. It's not Tony. It's not any individual necessarily. It really is the members of our profession supporting members of our profession. And it really is wonderful in that way. And because of that, I would guess to say what happens is I'm guessing Gateway is constantly going to be shifting in its focus. Right now, one of the really growing areas, totally unplanned for Gateway, is that so many offices are struggling now, both with recruiting and retaining their staff. And so Gateway now offers this service called On Demand. and essentially where we're able to bring temporary remote professionals over to an office and helping that office in a time of need, but also maybe in a time when they're just in a boom, not just bust, right? And so that was not something we sought out to do, and but now it's really in it's in demand, right? On demand is in demand. But what I imagine here, probably a year from now, if you were to ask me that question, I think we're going to be seeing more and more things. And I think that is going to be important for an organization like us to be able to be really focusing on really where we need to provide, we collectively. Now, I want to also make a point that we have associations. And we have NAFs in this country, NAFs and AIA and the Forum on Education Abroad, and there are many other organizations around the world. And these organizations are so very important. We need a strong NAFSA. We need a strong AIA, and that's so very important. But one of the challenges with these organizations is that they're often focused on their role, right? And an organization like Gateway, I hope will always be, and certainly even stronger across in 10 years from now, will be that irrespective of the knowledge community or irrespective of the source, the publication, the publisher, or whatever, that we're able to provide unfiltered, but certainly very helpful resources to everyone and to keep it free. And I think that's going to be very important. And I'm committed to that.
Yeah. And I have to also say, we're going to have another year of the Gateway Spotlight. So you can look forward to that. I do want to ask everyone who's watching or listening to come back, focus in, because I have a really important question for you. And let me know in the chat, do you like to watch the recordings of the Gateway Spotlight on YouTube, or would you like to have a podcast feed? So put YouTube or podcast in the chat so we know what you want to see in 2023. And I have I have an agenda here. Let's be honest. Yes. Okay. We got YouTube, podcast. Okay. Podcast is winning already. I think it's a very substantial and we have here. Oh, we got some both podcasts more. Okay, great. Thank you. Keep them coming. Let us know. So I wanted to come back to a question that's a little maybe spicy, saucy. Let's go. Let's do here. I want to know, because I alluded to this before, about opportunities and frustrations, or successes and frustrations. Since the pandemic, obviously, I feel like our whole world of international education has been turned on its head, upside down, up again, down again, all the things. And since then, obviously, I think we're in a new era because of the pandemic. What has been one thing? Just choose one development, one direction, one thing you're really proud of the field for achieving, for doing, or moving in a direction that you didn't know we would be capable of maybe before the pandemic?
I would say in some ways, my answer off the cuff might be related to all of higher education. And that is quickly the move to embrace other ways of learning and engagement. We don't always have to get on a plane to learn something. And I remember back in the maybe 20 years ago when when I was at Penn State at the time and we were talking about offering summer programs. I tell you, you would have thought it was the end of the world. Everybody said, oh, no, you can't offer summer education abroad. You cannot do it. You cannot do it. And then we talked about offering faculty directed programs. And we said, what? Programs of 2 weeks? No, you can't do it. And those reactions over the decades, and there are many others, those reactions always used to frustrate me because I thought duration is irrelevant, or is actually duration is relevant only really insofar as what it is that you want to be able to achieve by your program. So if you really want your students to learn Japanese, probably a 2-week trip or program to Japan isn't going to be, it's not going to do that.
Yeah.
So we really need to design our programs effectively. I remember having a conversation back at the University of Kentucky some years ago about this program wanted to go to China to study Chinese mining technology. 2 weeks is probably plenty to do that, maybe more than enough, right? Well, I look to today and I'm thinking, okay, now we see this spectrum of international learning and engagement. We've got to step away from one is better than the other, but to really start embracing is what is we want to do and then start choosing program modalities on that spectrum accordingly. I see organizations, and if you don't mind me saying, Brooke, your own organization, Podium Education Abroad, stepping into this mix today and offering really innovative modalities in supporting students' international learning and their understanding of technology and digital learning as well.
Mhm.
And I just find it just wonderful. Doesn't mean that's for every student. It just means for certain students who want to achieve a certain outcome, that might be an ideal modality. And there are many others that I could speak about today. So I think the thing I'm most pleased to see is that we are now expanding the spectrum. For me, living and learning and enjoying life along folks in Japan really changed my world. But for
Mhm.
other students today, that might be what they need to do. But other students can do other things, and we need not to let our own biases or our own lack of sophistication get in the way of that. We need to
Mhm.
continue to expand this spectrum of international learning and engagement. To me, I'm very proud of that. I think it's here to stay. Now we've just got to make it.
So we're going to save what frustrates you in a minute. So I'm going to leave you a few minutes to ponder that in the back of your mind. But I want to skip to some audience questions here. Michael Wolf. Hello, Michael. He's from Kappa. So if you guys are familiar with him and his work over at Kappa, he wrote, I have a question. Do you think we are a less secure place these days in that we are in a more hostile political environment? He's thinking about xenophobia, militant nationalism, attacks on humanities. We're a political world where what we do is not always seen as in a positive light. I'm less optimistic and or an old curmudgeon. I'm an old curmudgeon sometimes too, Mike. So I'm with you. So what are your thoughts? Do you feel like we're in a less safe environment as a profession based on all these factors?
First of all, thank you, Michael, for that question. And there are very few people in that do what we do that I have more respect for than Michael Wolf. He's been influential to me and so many others in the profession. So thank you, Michael, so much for being here. And that question, gosh, couldn't have thought of something more simple. But my answer would be really here is these are not new issues. Our students have dealt with this, our faculty have dealt with this. Yeah, they spike here and there. I had an article that I wrote here recently and maybe a month or so ago looking about questioning whether international education can support geopolitical tensions. I think this is not necessarily new. I think we do need our students to go out there and understand what questions people are asking, how they're answering those questions, what challenges they're facing, how are they addressing those challenges. We need to put sometimes our students, our faculty, ourselves in the hot seat in these issues. We need to know it's so easy for all of us to get into groupthink and somehow run to the shadow of intercultural when we're not really even quite sure what it means sometimes. So to me, these are important questions. I don't know that we're any less secure than we've been. I remember during 9/11, I was in Japan. I was actually the next morning, it was nighttime there, but the next morning I was in class. I was teaching a course then, and there were a whole bunch of students, and all the students were shocked, but one student was celebratory. I couldn't believe it. And I wanted to say, what the hell's wrong with you? But then I have to remember that this student had a different view of things. And he was celebratory because he says he thought maybe America will wake up and listen and think about how they're engaging in the world and how it's not always altruistic. And I thought, interesting point of view. Of course, we've since talked about that.
Yeah, and I think the challenge with that is even having a healthy dose of ning and I don't know, criticism, if you will, of ourselves as Americans or of the Western world or any identity group. And is also is seen as unpatriotic. Like we're in a time, I think, to Mike's question, where it's very black or white. It's one or the other. So there's either no questioning whatsoever or you're against the group. And I think that's where we as educators have to, one, at least demonstrate and model what it looks like to have a healthy dose of skepticism and questioning around the things that we're seeing while being respectful and not completely going against the grain, if you will. I don't know. I think, Mike, I don't have an answer for you. And definitely Tony's way smarter than me if he doesn't have an answer either. It's a big one. So we need to have Mike on this next time and you guys can go rat-a-tat-tat with all these deep questions. I love it. So we have another question that came into the question tab. And if anybody has one more question, we'll take one more after this, and happy to stay on, but we do want to wrap up at least within the hour. So the last one is, again, a deep one, and it is coming back to these tensions that Mike alluded to in his question, but also colonization and colonialism. But yeah, it's a big one. So do you think global racial capitalism is a driving factor in the changing rationales for global education? Because you mentioned the changing rationales before. They say, meaning surviving capitalism, the need to work in reliance on a specific way of working, everything beyond profit-based and future workforce focus.
Well, that's a hard question, and I really don't know that I have a comment. I was asked here recently to give a presentation up at Penn State, and I was so very intimidated by the presentation. It was about the business of international education, and so it was a presentation to a class, and I thought I had about an hour and a half, and I thought, okay, that I'll be able to do something. So we get in there. Almost 3 hours later, I was able to leave. I was starving, but nonetheless, a lot of folks are asking this kind of question. They are looking at these heavy questions, and I think I don't know that I have an answer, but I do think we need to keep asking those tough questions, because that's how we're going to enhance international learning and engagement or broadly defined comprehensive internationalization at our institutions. I think that's an important question. Capitalism certainly has become more and more a factor in the business of international education. Mm-hmm. Capitalism has certainly played a larger role around the world, there's no doubt. But I think there are other ways of understanding the world. And sometimes capitalism, in my opinion, shuts us down from seeing other ways of living and engaging in the world.
Yeah. I think when it comes to the focus on, if we narrow down on international education, this idea of capitalism, I think going back to my conversation I had with Angela Schaefer of the Fund for Education Abroad, we talked about scholarships and helping fund these experiences. But one of the things we talked about too is, let's talk about the elephant in the room, and let's talk about the cost of these experiences and who sets those prices. And it's not a truly altruistic model, especially once you've seen how the sausage is made, especially for private organizations. And so I think we also have to look hard in the mirror and being willing to, again, have those hard conversations, but necessary conversations about who's setting the rules of play here and making things more accessible or not. And throwing more scholarship money isn't the only modality to get more access and equity. And I think this is also an indictment of higher education in general, not just international ed. It's driven by capitalism in so many ways. Those were all anonymously submitted. So thank you, those of you who asked, but I would love to know who's asking these tough gotcha questions. We had one more come in. Oh, John Duncan says, have a happy and healthy holiday. So thank you, John, for being here and saying such nice things. And Caleb, thank you for telling us what you're talking about, that you submitted this question. So he says, if Tony could go back in time and study abroad anywhere, Caleb, you stole my thunder. This is my closing question. If you could go back in time and study abroad anywhere, aside from Japan, obviously you didn't study abroad technically, or Argentina, where would you go and why? And I will also add a layer on this, but knowing everything you know now. So you're not a student who's, I don't know anything, everything you know now, but you could study abroad anywhere. Where would you go?
Gosh, Caleb, that's an interesting question. And I don't know that my answer is really relevant to anybody here, but I will just say that I mentioned earlier, I had never really traveled abroad or really even outside of Kentucky until I was 18. And now fast forward, I've been to, like many people else here, I've been to over 90 countries in the world. And I feel like, gosh, I feel so wonderfully fortunate to have been able to see, if only briefly, different parts of the world and understanding just how wonderful this world is and how delicate, in fact, that it is as well. I don't know that I would answer, I don't know that I could answer the question, Caleb, about where, but I definitely think I could answer the question, what? And I really, honestly, and this is for no rhyme or reason, but I really wish I would have learned Spanish.
Yeah, but you speak Japanese. So
Well,
that's
the
not.
Japanese doesn't get me very far in Pennsylvania, but Spanish would be very helpful. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. I agree. Yeah, the language learning piece is probably my biggest. Oh, why didn't I just go all in on something? Instead, I studied like 7 languages. Bad. This was amazing, Tony. Are you glad you did this? Are you glad I let you? I
Well,
pulled your.
folks, if I've embarrassed myself, please don't comment in the chat. But I have to say, Brooke, thank you very much for having me here.
Yeah.
It's a lot of fun. I tell you, I was a bit nervous, folks, and I hope I didn't too terribly embarrass myself. But I really want to appreciate everybody for being here.
Well,
This was
Kevin
great.
says this was great. Caleb says it was great. Yeah, people are loving it. So we'll have to make this an annual thing. So a wrap up talking to Tony about the deep issues conversation every December. Thank you again, Tony, for coming on the show. Thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of the Gateway International Group as the host of this show. And I'm excited for more great shows in the future. Thank you all so much for being here and supporting the show this year as our sort of little experiment. And we're going to be taking it to another level in 2023 and hopefully bringing you that podcast feed that I alluded to, as well as the YouTube channel and many more in really interesting interviews and conversations to come. So thank you all. Have a wonderful holidays and a happy new year. And we will see you in 2023. Thanks all.